Alistair Finch stood in the pouring rain, watching his $4 billion skyscraper be seized by the city, while I sat in his former boardroom, sipping tea from a cup that cost more than his car, signing the deed to his entire legacy. He called Hestia Vane-Redmond a stain on progress, a relic of the past. He laughed while his goons tossed $1 million check at my feet. He thought he was clearing a path for his future. He didn't realize he was digging his own grave. As I adjusted my obsidian hourglass pendant, the sand stopped moving. Alistair's architects made one fatal error. They built 50 feet into the bedrock. They forgot to check who owned the soil beneath the street. A king's grant from 1890-2. In the next few minutes, you will see how a quiet woman in a tea house dismantled a global predator. This is a masterclass in systemic destruction. Pay attention, because once you learn the law of the soil, no one can ever evict you again. I am writing part 1 of the script for the ground beneath his throne. The rain over the city did not just fall. It reclaimed the streets. It washed away the temporary noise of the modern world, leaving only the heavy silence of stone and history. Inside my tea house, the air smelled of dried jasmine and old leather, a scent that took decades to cure. I sat at the corner table. The wood beneath my palms was oak, harvested before the Great Depression. It was solid. It was immovable, much like the woman who sat behind it. Hestia Vane-Redmond. I was not watching the door. I was listening to the city. I could hear the vibration of the subway lines deep underground. I could feel the weight of the skyscrapers pressing down on the tectonic plates. Most people look at a city and see lights. I see a balance sheet. I see the invisible threads of debt that hold the sky up. The bell above the door didn't ring. It gasped. Alistair Finch entered the room like a virus entering a healthy cell. He was a man made of synthetic materials. His suit was a neon-checkered nightmare of Italian wool. Expensive, but loud. It screamed for attention, the way a drowning man screams for air. Behind him were 2 men. They were built like brick walls and had the intellectual depth of wet cement. Alistair didn't remove his hat. He didn't acknowledge the closed sign. He simply walked to the center of my sanctuary. The heels of his pointed leather shoes clicked against the floorboards. Each step was an insult to the craftsmanship of the 1800s. He looked around the room with a sneer. His eyes landed on the shelves of ancient porcelain. He saw dust where I saw heritage. He saw a crumbling building where I saw a fortress. He stopped at my table. He didn't ask to sit. He leaned over, placing his manicured hands on my oak. Hestia, he said. The way he spoke my name was a violation. He used a tone people usually reserve for a disobedient pet. I didn't look up from my tea. I was watching the steam rise. It formed patterns of chaos and order. Alistair continued. This place is a stain on progress. Look at the skyline. I am building a $4 billion hub, a temple of glass and light. And here you are, selling dried leaves in a dark room. It is embarrassing. For the city. And for you, I remained silent. My silence was a wall. Most people speak because they are afraid of the void. I lived in the void during my years at the IMF. I knew that the person who speaks first is the person who is losing the negotiation. Alistair reached into his inner pocket. He pulled out a slip of paper. He didn't hand it to me. He tossed it. It fluttered through the air like a wounded bird. It landed next to my teacup. A $1 million check, signed in aggressive gold ink. That is market value, plus a 20% bonus for your trouble, Alistair said. He straightened his tie, looking at his reflection in the glass of my window. Take it. Buy a nice condo in the suburbs, somewhere with central heating. This block is mine now. The demolition crews arrive on Monday. I finally looked at him. My eyes are the color of a cold hearth. He flinched, only for a millisecond. But I saw it. I saw the pulse jump in his neck. I reached up. My fingers found the obsidian hourglass pendant hanging from my neck. The black glass was cold. The sand inside was perfectly still. Frozen in time, Alistair, I said. My voice was a whisper. but it carried the weight of a landslide. Do you know why I don't use a bank? He laughed. A hollow sound. Because you are stuck in the past. No, I said. Because I understand the nature of a contract. You see $1 million. I see a liability. You see a tea house. I see a legal chokehold. I picked up the check. The paper felt cheap. Mass-produced. I didn't look at the numbers. I looked at the signature. It was the signature of a man who thought he was untouchable. I began to tear it. The sound of the paper. Ripping was the only noise in the room. I tore it once, then twice. Then I dropped the pieces into my steaming cup of jasmine tea. The ink began to bleed, turning the golden liquid into a dark, murky gray. Alistair's face turned the color of a bruised plum. The veins in his forehead throbbed. He leaned in closer. His breath smelled of expensive scotch and desperation. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, he hissed. I will have the city council condemn this building by sunset. I will bury you under so much litigation that your grandchildren will be born in debt. You have no idea who you are dealing with. I leaned back. The obsidian hourglass caught the dim light. It seemed to glow with a dark, internal energy dot. I know exactly who you are, Alistair, I said. You are a man who builds on sand. You are a man who thinks that owning the surface means owning the world. I touched the pendant. Again. But you made a mistake in your due diligence. You checked the property records. But you didn't check the king's grant. You didn't look at the subterranean transit rights. Alistair sneered. What is that supposed to mean? It means, I said, that your $4 billion tower is currently trespassing on my soil, 50 feet below the pavement, where your foundations are being poured. You are standing on my ceiling, Alistair. I stood up. I am much taller than people expect. I looked down at him. You offered me $1 million to leave. I said, now? I am going to charge you $100 million for every hour your workers are in my bedrock. The room went cold. The two men behind Alistair shifted their weight. They sensed the shift in power. They were predators. And they realized they were in a cage with something much larger than themselves. Alistair tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. I am Hestia Vane-Redmond, I whispered. I don't move for progress. Progress moves for me. Get out of my shop. Before I decide to foreclose on your breath, Alistair didn't say another word. He turned on his heel and fled into the rain. His goons followed him. Stumbling over the threshold, I sat back down. I watched the gray tea in my cup. The sand in the obsidian hourglass began to fall, one grain at a time. The war had begun, and Alistair Finch had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. The $1 million check rested on the dark oak of my table. It was a small, rectangular piece of arrogance. To Alistair Finch, it was a weapon, a master key designed to unlock any door and silence any voice. To me, Hestia Vane-Redmond, it was an admission of weakness. I did not look at the check. I looked at the man. Alistair was leaning over my workspace. His neon-checkered suit jacket was pulled tight across his shoulders. He smelled of expensive cologne and the metallic scent of a man who spent too much time in air-conditioned offices. He was waiting for the gasp. He was waiting for the moment my eyes would widen, and I would thank him for his generosity. I reached out. My hand was steady. My skin, a deep, matte obsidian, looked like carved stone against the white paper of the check. I picked it up with 2 fingers. You call this market value, Alistair, I said. My voice was a low, controlled vibration. Alistair smirked. He straightened his tie, looking at his reflection in the antique mirror behind me. It is more than market value, Hestia. It is a gift. A chance for you to leave this dusty corner and retire in luxury. You are holding the future in your hands. Don't drop it. I felt the weight of the obsidian hourglass pendant against my chest. I reached up with my free hand and gripped the cold, black glass. The sand inside was frozen. It was a sign. The time for talking was over. The time for deletion had begun. I began to tear the check. I didn't do it quickly. I did it with the precision of a surgeon. The sound of the paper fibers snapping was loud in the quiet tea house. It was the sound of a billion-dollar dream beginning to crack. Alistair's smirk vanished. His eyes widened. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He watched, paralyzed, as I tore the million-dollar check into thin, vertical strips. I dropped the pieces into my steaming cup of jasmine tea. The hot liquid immediately began to soak into the paper. The gold ink of his signature began to dissolve, turning into a dark, greasy smudge that floated on the surface of the amber tea. I picked up a silver spoon and stirred. "You are insane," Alistair whispered. His voice was jagged, breaking under the weight of his shock. "You just threw away $1 million. Do you have any idea who I am? I own this city. I have the mayor on speed dial. I have a $4 billion tower rising 3 blocks from here. I will crush you." I leaned back in my chair. The movement was slow, graceful. I was no longer the tea lady he thought he was bullying. I was the grandmother of global debt. The woman who once moved $3 trillion in a single afternoon without leaving her office in Geneva, Alistair, I said. My voice was so quiet it forced him to lean in, to enter my space, to feel the coldness of my resolve. "You think you own this city because you bought the air. You think you are a king because you built a tower of glass and steel. But you made a fundamental error in your due diligence." Alistair sneered. His face was turning a dangerous shade of red. "My lawyers don't make errors. Hestia, we have the titles. We have the permits." I leaned forward. The light from the window caught the sharp angle of my JAWLINE. "Your lawyers looked at the surface. They looked at what the modern world calls property. But they didn't look deep enough. They didn't go back to 1890-2. I touched the obsidian hourglass again. This tea house sits on a king's grant, a sovereign deed that predates the city charter. It wasn't just a grant for the land. It was a grant for the subterranean mineral and transit rights. Alistair's brow furrowed. "Mineral rights. What does that have to do with me? This is a city, not a gold mine. It has everything to do with you." I said, "Your tower, the Finch Horizon, is designed to be the tallest in the hemisphere. To support that weight, your engineers had to dig deep. They had to bypass the clay and the gravel. They had to bite into the bedrock." I paused, letting the silence fill the room. "That bedrock belongs to me, Alistair, in perpetuity. From the sidewalk down to the core of the planet. I own the stone your building is resting on." Alistair laughed. It was a high, nervous sound. "That is impossible. You can't own the ground under the street." "I can," I said. "And I do. Your foundations have penetrated my private property, 50 feet below the pavement. You are a trespasser." I pointed to the floor. "You aren't clearing a path for progress, Alistair. You are standing on my trestan. You are standing on my ceiling. Every floor of your $4 billion monument is technically an illegal attachment to my soil." The color drained from Alistair's face. He looked at the floorboards, as if he could see through the wood and the dirt into the dark stone below. He realized then that I wasn't bluffing. No one speaks with that much calm unless they are holding the winning hand. In this jurisdiction, I continued, a permanent attachment to private property belongs to the owner of the land. It is called the doctrine of accession. I took a slow sip of the tea. "Ignoring the floating pieces of his $1 million check. By building your foundations into my bedrock without my consent, you have effectively gifted me your tower. I don't need your $1 million, Alistair. I already own your $4 billion. Dream?" Alistair backed away from the table. He stumbled over his own feet. His neon suit looked ridiculous in the presence of someone with real ancient power. "I will sue you into the Stone Age," he hissed. But the fire was gone from his eyes. There was only fear. I didn't answer. I just watched him. He turned and fled. The bell above the door rang one last time, a sharp, lonely sound. I reached up and let go of the obsidian hourglass pendant. A single grain of sand fell. The quiet refusal was over. The loud destruction was about to begin. One moment, the ground was screaming with the effort of $4 billion of machinery. The next, there was only the sound of the rain hitting the ivy outside my window. It was a heavy, wet silence that felt like a funeral shroud. I sat in my oak chair. My fingers were interlaced, resting on the dark wood of the table. I could feel the microscopic shifts in the air pressure as the city's power grid adjusted to the sudden loss of the site's massive electrical draw. I reached up and touched the obsidian hourglass pendant. The black glass felt like a piece of frozen time. Alistair Finch was currently standing in a hole, a $4 billion hole. He would be looking at the black SUVs, looking at the men in the tactical vests. He would be trying to process the fact that his money was useless here. I began to imagine the scene in his lead counsel's office. It would be a room filled with the scent of old mahogany and high-priced anxiety. 6 lawyers, the best money could buy, would be hunched over a light table. They would be staring at the King's Grant of 1892. The document was not made of modern paper. It was vellum, thick and stubborn. The ink was a dark, iron gall mixture that had bitten into the skin of the animal a century ago. It didn't just describe a plot of land. It described a negative easement. A negative easement is a legal ghost. It doesn't give you the right to build. It gives you the right to stop others from building. It is a veto over the sky and the earth. Alistair's senior partner, a man named Silas Thorne, would be the first to realize the gravity of the situation. He would be tracing the lineage of the deed with a trembling finger. Silas, Alistair would scream over the speakerphone. Why aren't we filing for an emergency stay? Why aren't the drills moving? Silas would look at the signature at the bottom of the deed. It wasn't just a name. It was a cipher. The Vane-Redmond Trust, Alistair. Silas would say, his voice a dry, paper-thin whisper. We cannot file a stay against a sovereign veto. This easement doesn't just cover the tea house. It covers the structural integrity zone of the entire district. Under this deed, Hestia Vane-Redmond has the right to light, air, and subterranean silence. By digging 50 feet down, you didn't just trespass. You violated a silence covenant. I took a slow, measured breath. The jasmine in the air was cold now. I leaned forward and looked at the silver bob of my hair in the dark tea. I was Hestia Vane-Redmond, and I was the owner of the silence. The lawyers would be digging through the archives now, looking for a way to break the trust. They would be searching for a weakness in my history. They would find nothing. They would find that the Vane-Redmond Trust had been the primary underwriter for the city's first subway line. They would find that we had funded the harbor project in 1924. We didn't just own the land. We owned the debt that allowed the city to exist. Silas Thorne would realize that Hestia Vane-Redmond was not a tea lady. She was the grandmother of global debt. She is a shadow. Alistair Silas would continue. He would be ignoring the screaming from the phone now. He would be looking at his own retirement fund, realizing that the bank he used was owned by a holding company that was owned by the Vane-Redmond Trust. Every time Alistair spent $1, he was technically borrowing it from me. I reached for my silver stylus. I opened my ledger. I didn't write Alistair's name again. I drew a single, vertical line through it, a deletion in progress dot at the site. The black SUVs were not leaving. They were deploying seismic sensors. They were measuring the damage Alistair's drills had done to the sovereign bedrock. Every vibration, every crack in the stone, was now being billed back to Alistair as environmental treason. He had called my shop a stain on progress. He had tried to buy my history for $1 million. Now he was going to spend every cent he had ever made trying to pay for the silence. He had broken. I adjusted the obsidian hourglass. A single grain of sand fell. The legal ghost had appeared, and it was hungry. Alistair would try to find me tonight. He would come to the tea house. He would bring a bigger check. He would bring promises. But you cannot buy the wind. And you cannot own the earth. If the earth has already decided to bury you, I am Hestia Vane-Redmond, and I am the architect of the silence that will follow Alistair Finch. I stood up and walked to the door. I placed my hand on the brass handle. It felt like the hilt of a sword. The construction halt was the spark. The legal ghost was the fuel. Tomorrow, the city would watch the fire. The digital heart of the city began to bleed red. It was a silent, algorithmic massacre. The panic did not start with shouting on a trading floor. It started in the quiet, air-conditioned server rooms of the world's largest hedge funds. In London, in Dubai, in Hong Kong, the smart money has ears that can hear a pin drop in a hurricane, and they had just heard the sound of Alistair Finch's $4 billion dream hitting a sovereign wall. I sat in the dark of my study. The only light came from the soft glow of a vintage green desk lamp and the faint, eerie shimmer of the obsidian hourglass pendant around my neck. I watched the global markets on 3 separate monitors. It was like watching a symphony I had composed decades ago. The notice of clouded title had traveled through the financial wires like a virus. By building his foundations into the sovereign bedrock, Alistair had effectively turned his skyscraper into a legal ghost. Under the Fiduciary Duty Act, no institutional investor can hold an asset with a clouded title. It is the financial equivalent of a death sentence. I saw the first exit. A sovereign wealth fund from the Middle East pulled their $800 million stake at 10:42 a.m. They didn't call Alistair. They didn't ask for an explanation. They simply liquidated. They took the loss on the principle to avoid the total annihilation of the legal fallout. Then came the contagion. Risk managers in New York saw the movement. They saw the classified status of the construction halt. To a banker, classified means unrecoverable. They began to dump Finch Global Holdings. The stock price was no longer falling. It was evaporating. Alistair would be watching this from his glass penthouse. I could see him in my mind. The neon-checkered suit would be soaked in cold sweat. He would be screaming at his traders to buy the dip. But there was no dip. There was only the abyss. He didn't realize that I hadn't just attacked his building. I had attacked the concept of him by triggering the sovereign lien. I had invalidated his force majeure insurance. He was now personally liable for every dollar of the debt. The banks were not just freezing his project. They were preparing to seize his cars, his planes, his collection of modern art, everything he used to prove he was a new money king. I reached up and touched the obsidian hourglass. The black glass was freezing cold. It felt like holding a piece of the void. I adjusted the pendant, feeling the sharp architectural lines of my own jaw tighten. This was the moment I lived for. The moment when the arrogant realize that the world is not made of glass. It is made of ancient, unyielding stone. The rain outside turned into a violent, tropical storm. It lashed against the windows of the city, turning the neon lights into blurred, bloody streaks. Alistair's office would be a war room of despair. His lawyers would be packing their bags. They knew the Vane-Redmond name. They knew that when the grandmother of global debt moves, you don't fight. You flee. At 2 p.m., the final blow landed. The Internal Revenue Service issued a jeopardy assessment. Because the project was no longer a viable business. The $800 million in deferred taxes from his Section 1031 exchange became due within 24 hours. Alistair Finch was officially bankrupt. He just didn't know how to tell the world. He did what all broken men do. He went back to the source of his pain. I watched his black Maybach skid to a halt in front of my tea house through the security feed on my tablet. The car was worth more than most homes. But in the pouring rain, it looked like a funeral carriage. Alistair jumped out. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't care about his hair or his neon suit anymore. He ran toward the ivy-covered door. He was stumbling. His hands were shaking so hard he almost fell into the mud he had tried to buy. He began to pound on the door. "Hestia," he screamed. His voice was cracked, stripped of the polished private school accent. "Hestia, open the door, please. We can talk about this. I'll give you anything. 5 million. 10 million. Name your price." He pounded until his knuckles were raw. He put his face against the glass, trying to see into the dark sanctuary, but there was no one there. I had left the tea house an hour ago. I didn't want to see his face. I didn't need to hear his pleas. To me, he was already a ghost. The closed sign on the door was not just a sign. It was a statement of finality. I had moved my operation to a secure, black site penthouse owned by the trust. I was watching him from 5 miles away, through a lens he couldn't see. Alistair slid down the door. He sat on the wet stone step. The rain soaked through his expensive wool. He put his head in his hands and wept. The sound of his sobbing was drowned out by the thunder. He had come to beg, but there was no one to hear him. He had come to bargain, but he had nothing left to trade. He looked up at the closed sign. The gold lettering seemed to mock him in the lightning flashes. The Vane-Redmond Tea House, established 1892. He realized then, in the cold and the dark, that he wasn't fighting a woman. He was fighting a century. He was fighting the very earth he had tried to conquer. I adjusted the obsidian hourglass pendant one last time. The sand inside began to flow upward. A physical impossibility. A sign that the natural order of Alistair's world had been inverted. He was no longer the hunter. He was the debt, and I was the liquidator. That market panic was complete. The project was frozen in the ice of a sovereign deed. Alistair Finch was a man with a $4 billion tower and $0 in his pocket. I turned off the monitors. The room went into total darkness, except for the faint, dark glow of the hourglass. I am Hestia Vane-Redmond, and I have never lost a penny. Or a war. The city could keep the glass. I kept the soil. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a cathedral of vanity. It was a space designed to make the powerful feel immortal. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, casting a fractured, golden light over 500 of the city's most dangerous predators. The air was a heavy mixture of vintage gardenias, expensive cigars, and the sharp, metallic scent of desperation in the center of the room. Alistair Finch was a drowning man. He was wearing a neon-checkered suit that looked like a scream in a library. His tie was slightly crooked. His face was a mask of forced confidence. He was surrounded by a circle of investors, men with eyes like cold marble. They weren't there to celebrate. They were there to scavenge. Alistair was speaking too loudly. His hands were moving too fast. He was trying to explain the temporary delay at the Finch Horizon site. He was using words like structural anomaly and administrative oversight. But the men around him weren't listening to his words. They were listening to the market. And the market was telling them that Alistair Finch was a corpse. Then, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. The sound of the orchestra didn't stop, but it seemed to fade into the background. A ripple of silence traveled through the crowd, like a cold wind blowing through a field of wheat. People turned. They stopped drinking. They stopped lying. I stepped into the light. I wore a gown of charcoal silk that was so dark it seemed to absorb the room's golden glow. It was a perfect match for my skin, which looked like matte obsidian under the chandeliers. My hair, the symmetrical, silver-white architectural bob, was a blade of light in the darkness. My jawline was a sharp, uncompromising angle around my neck. The obsidian hourglass pendant rested against my collarbone. It was heavy, cold. The black glass was dark. But as I walked, it caught the light. The sand inside was no longer still. It was moving, steady. Silent fall of gray grains. The grandmother of global debt had arrived. I didn't look for Alistair. I didn't need to. I could feel his gaze. It was a prickle of heat in the coldness of the ballroom. I walked through the crowd. People parted from me as if I were a ghost. They didn't know my name, but they knew the gravity I carried. They knew the smell of institutional power. In my mind, I was counting. 1 step for every floor Alistair was losing. 2 steps for every investor who was about to call their lawyers. I saw the mayor standing at the head of the room. He was a man built of soft compromises and expensive suits. He had spent his career trying to balance the needs of the city with the greeds of the elite. But he knew the truth. He knew that the city's infrastructure, the water, the power, the subways, all rested on a foundation he didn't control. As I approached, the mayor's conversation died. He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw the fear of 1,000 years in his eyes. "Hestia," he whispered. The word was a prayer and a plea. I stopped 3 feet from him. I didn't smile. I didn't offer my hand. I simply stood there, a sovereign entity in a room full of tenants. The mayor did something that caused a collective gasp to echo through the ballroom. He didn't just nod. He bowed. It was a deep, formal bow, the kind of bow a servant gives to a monarch. "Your presence honors us. Hestia Vane-Redmond," the mayor said. His voice was loud enough for Alistair to hear. He turned to the crowd, making a gesture toward me. "For those who do not know, this is the woman who holds the keys to the bedrock of our city, the guardian of the king's grant." The silence in the room became absolute. I felt the weight of 500 stares. But my eyes were on Alistair. He was frozen. His glass of champagne was tilting in his hand. The liquid was dripping onto the marble floor. But he didn't notice. He was looking at the bow. He was looking at the way the mayor's spine curved in my presence. He realized then that I wasn't a tea lady. I wasn't a neighbor with a grievance. I was the landlord of the city. I reached up and touched the obsidian hourglass. The sand was falling faster now. A blur of gray dot. Alistair broke from his circle of investors. He stumbled toward us, his neon suit looking like trash in the presence of my charcoal silk mayor. He stammered, "What are you doing?" "This woman is an extortionist. She is holding my site hostage. She is destroying the city's future for a 100-year-old deed." The mayor looked at Alistair. There was no pity in his eyes, only a weary disgust. "Alistair," the mayor said, "you are a man who looks at a map and sees numbers. You should have looked at the history." The mayor turned back to me. His head was still slightly lowered. "The city council has reviewed the subterranean transit rights, Hestia. We acknowledge the validity of the 1892 covenant. We have issued a formal apology for the administrative error that allowed Mr. Finch to break ground on sovereign bedrock." I finally spoke. My voice was a whisper that cut through the ballroom. "It's like a razor dot. An apology does not settle a debt, Mayor." I said, "The construction on my soil. It's caused a structural imbalance in the sovereign silence. Under the terms of the grant, the city is now in default of its maintenance agreement with the Vane-Redmond Trust." The mayor's face went pale. He knew what that meant. The city's total municipal debt, $3 billion, was held by a consortium of banks, and that consortium was managed by the IMF during my tenure. I had moved that debt into a private sovereign trust 5 years ago. I now owned the city's debt, and Alistair Finch had just triggered the default clause. I looked at Alistair. His mouth was hanging open. He looked like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. "You thought you were buying a block, Alistair," I said. "But you were just activating a lien, because your foundations violated the bedrock. The city's entire debt is now due, in full." Within 48 hours, the mayor looked at Alistair. "Alistair, your project is no longer a building. It is the collateral for this city's survival. We are seizing the site. We are seizing your assets. We are doing it to save this city from the debt you triggered." Alistair's glass hit the floor. The sound of it shattering was the final note of his symphony. He looked around the room. The investors were already turning away. They were pulling their phones from their pockets. They were calling their brokers. They were deleting his name from their contacts. He was a man alone, in a neon suit, in a room full of people who had already forgotten he existed. I adjusted the obsidian hourglass pendant. The sand stopped. The deletion was complete. I turned my back on the mayor. I turned my back on Alistair. I walked toward the exit, the charcoal silk of my gown trailing behind me like a shadow. I didn't look back. The city was mine. The Bedrock was mine. And Alistair Finch was a footnote in a ledger I had already closed. The soil doesn't take bribes. It only takes what is owed, and tonight. The debt was settled in gold and silence. I am Hestia Vane-Redmond, and I am the architect of the ground you walk on. The rain outside did not just fall. It hammered. It was a relentless, rhythmic interrogation of the city's glass and steel. Inside the tea house, the air was a vacuum of silence, cold, still, smelling of dried jasmine and the sharp, metallic scent of a coming storm. I sat in my high-backed oak chair. My fingers were interlaced. Resting on the dark wood, I am Hestia Vane-Redmond. And I was waiting for the sound of a dying ego. The bell above the door didn't ring. It gasped. Alistair Finch entered. He was a man made of synthetic confidence. But today, the fabric was fraying. His neon-checkered suit was soaked through, the vibrant colors looking dull and bruised in the dim light. He didn't look like a titan of private equity. He looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath his feet was actually a trapdoor. He walked to the center of the room. His breathing was heavy, ragged. He looked at the porcelain cups, the ancient maps, the silver bob of my hair. He was looking for a weakness. He found only an architectural jawline and a silence that felt like a burial. "Hestia," he said. His voice was a dry rasp, tearing through the quiet. "You had your fun. You stopped the site. You called the mayor, but you're playing a dangerous game. My lawyers are already drafting the injunction. By tomorrow morning, the drills will be moving again, and I will have you evicted for interfering with a project of public interest." I didn't answer. I didn't even blink. I reached up and touched the obsidian hourglass pendant. The black glass was freezing. It felt like holding a fragment of the midnight sky. I watched a single grain of sand fall, a tiny, gray speck of destiny. Alistair leaned over my table. His hands were shaking. "You don't know who you're dealing with? I have $4 billion behind me. I have the support of every major bank in the city. You're just a woman in a tea house with an old piece of paper." I finally spoke. My voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a landslide. "Alistair," I said, "you speak of billions as if they are your own, but you are a creature of leverage. You didn't build that tower with your money. You built it with debt." I leaned forward. The golden light of the lamp caught the matte finish of my skin. "You borrowed $4 billion from a consortium of 3 European banks. You thought you were dealing with institutions. You thought you were dealing with faceless boardrooms. But you forgot one thing." He sneered. "What?" "Institutions have owners." I said, "During my 20 years as a lead liquidator at the IMF, I learned that the world isn't run by the people who have the money. It is run by the people who hold the paper." I reached into the drawer of my desk. I pulled out a single, thick document. It was bound in blue silk. The seal at the bottom was not a bank logo. It was the wax imprint of the Vane-Redmond Trust. I slid the document across the oak table, read the secondary market purchase agreement. Alistair, he picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the text. Fast. Desperate, I watched the pulse jump in his neck. I watched the sweat bead on his upper lip. His face didn't just go pale. It turned the color of a guttering candle. "What is this?" He whispered. "It is a receipt. I said yesterday while you were screaming at the mayor. My trust purchased your entire debt portfolio from the European consortium at a discount. They were happy to sell, Alistair. They saw the classified shutdown. They saw the clouded title. They saw you as a liability. I am no longer your neighbor, Alistair. I am your lender." I touched the obsidian hourglass. The sand was falling faster now, steady. Gray blur. I took a slow sip of my tea. It was cold, bitter, perfect, under the negative covenant clause of your loan agreement. Any legal dispute regarding the property title constitutes a technical default. And under the cross-default protocol, a default on the land lease triggers an immediate acceleration of the principal. I watched him realize what that meant. He wasn't just losing the project. He was losing his life's work. "You owe me $4 billion. Alistair," I said. My voice was as cold as the pendant against my skin. "And according to the contract, the payment is due in full." Within 24 hours, he dropped the papers. They fluttered to the floor like the wings of a fallen bird. "You can't do this. I don't have $4 billion in liquid assets. Everything is tied up in the tower, I know," I said. "Which brings us to the security interest clause. Since you cannot pay the debt, the Vane-Redmond Trust has exercised its right of strict foreclosure. I haven't just seized the project. I have seized the company, the assets, the penthouse, the cars. Even the suit you are wearing is technically my property." Alistair stumbled back. He looked around the tea house as if the walls were closing in. "You want the tower? Fine. Take it. You'll be the one dealing with the lawsuits. You'll be the one losing millions a day." I shook my head. "I don't want the tower, Alistair. I have already signed a demolition order. Tomorrow morning, the city's structural engineers will begin dismantling your dream. It will be turned into a historical preservation park, a green space where people can sit and remember that the ground has a memory. But I'm not finished with you." I stood up. I was much taller than he expected. The shadows of the tea house seemed to grow behind me. I walked around the table. The clicking of my heels on the floorboards sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. I stopped 6 inches from him. I could smell the fear coming off him in waves. "Your penthouse office? The one with the view of the city. I am not selling it. I am not closing it. I am keeping it. And I am moving my tea house there. And you, Alistair." I reached out. My fingers brushed the neon-checkered fabric of his sleeve. "You are now my tenant. I have filed an attachment of earnings on your personal bank accounts. You will continue to work for me. You will be the janitor of the very park I am building on the ruins of your skyscraper. You will scrub the marble. You will trim the ivy. You will spend the rest of your life serving the dirt you tried to insult." Alistair didn't scream. He didn't fight. He simply collapsed. He sank to his knees in the center of my shop, his head bowed, his hands resting in the dust. I looked down at him. My face was a mask of cold, institutional indifference. I adjusted the obsidian hourglass pendant. The sand stopped moving. The deletion was total. I walked to the window and looked out at the rain. The city was dark, but the ground was mine. I am Hestia Vane-Redmond, and I have never seen a debt. I couldn't collect off the debt is not just money, Alistair. It is the weight of your own arrogance. And today, you are finally feeling the gravity. Midnight at the summit of the Finch. Horizon Tower felt like being inside a diamond suspended in a storm. The floor-to-ceiling glass was a barrier between two worlds. Outside, the rain lashed against the structure with a violence that made the steel frame groan. A low, constant vibration that sounded like the city itself was trying to reject the building. Inside, the air was pressurized and sterile. It smelled of expensive Italian leather, synthetic air conditioning, and the cold, bitter scent of a man who had realized he was a ghost. Alistair Finch sat on the floor of his own office. The neon-checkered suit he was so proud of was a crumpled ruin. His tie had been discarded hours ago. His hair, once a perfectly groomed weapon of vanity, was matted to his forehead. He wasn't looking at the view of the city he thought he conquered. He was looking at the woman sitting in his executive chair. I sat in the darkness. My charcoal silk gown flowed over the leather of his chair like liquid shadow. I did not move. I did not need to. I watched the rain streaks on the glass, each one a tiny, liquid line of debt. I reached up and touched the obsidian hourglass pendant. The matte obsidian of my skin was almost indistinguishable from the black glass of the pendant in this light. Only the silver-white edge of my architectural bob caught the moonlight. I felt the cold weight of the hourglass. The sand inside was perfectly, terrifyingly still. Hestia, Alistair whispered. His voice was a dry rattle, a sound made by a throat that had spent the last 12 hours screaming at lawyers who had already abandoned him. Just tell me what you want. You've taken the site. You've killed the stock. You've turned the city against me. What is left to take? I turned the chair slowly. The mechanism was silent, smooth, the movement of a predator who owns the ground the prey is standing on. Alistair, I said. My voice was a low, melodic whisper that carried the gravity of a funeral bell. You are still thinking in terms of assets. You are still thinking in terms of money. You don't understand that you didn't just trespass on my soil. You committed a violation of the sovereign silence. I leaned forward. The gold desk lamp cast a long, sharp shadow of my jawline across the mahogany surface. I placed a single sheet O. Alistair, I said. My voice was a low, melodic whisper that carried the gravity of a funeral bell. You are still thinking in terms of assets. You are still thinking in terms of money. You don't understand that you didn't just trespass on my soil. You committed a violation of the sovereign silence. I leaned forward. The gold desk lamp cast a long, sharp shadow of my jawline across the mahogany surface. I placed a single sheet of vellum on the desk. It wasn't modern paper. It was thick, yellowed with age, and bore the wax seal of the Vane-Redmond Trust. This, I said, is the reversion clause? Alistair crawled toward the desk. His hands were shaking so hard the cuffs of his expensive shirt rattled. He reached for the paper as if it were a holy relic. Or a death warrant. Read the third paragraph. Alistair, I whispered. His eyes darted across the text. I watched his pupils dilate. I watched the pulse in his neck jump with a frantic, irregular rhythm. He was reading the doctrine of accession as applied to the 1892 King's Grant. It states, I continued, that any structure permanently affixed to the sovereign bedrock without the explicit, written consent of the grant holder is not a separate entity. It is an accessory of the soil in the eyes of the highest law. Okay, Alistair, your tower is not yours. It never was, because you anchored it into my bedrock. The building, the glass, the steel, and the air it occupies reverts to the owner of the soil. In perpetuity, Alistair shook his head. His eyes were glazed with a terrifying realization. No, that can't be right. We have the permits. We have the city's blessing. The city cannot bless what it does not own. I said, you built your $4 billion dream on my ceiling. And under the reversionary interest protocol, I am now exercising my right to take possession. Not just of the site, but of everything associated with it. I pushed a silver fountain pen across the desk. It caught the light like a needle dot. Sign it, I said. He looked at the pen, then at me. Sign what? The total ontological surrender. I whispered, by signing this, you acknowledge that Finch Global Holdings is a hollow shell. You acknowledge that every asset you claim to own is an illegal encumbrance on my land. You surrender your companies, your holdings, and most importantly, you surrender the name. He flinched as if I had struck him. The name Dot. The name Finch. I said, Dot, from the moment you sign this, you are no longer Alistair Finch. The Finch legacy is erased. The name will be removed from the tower. It will be removed from the charity boards. It will be removed from the historical records of this city. You will leave this room as a man without a history. A man who never existed. I touched the obsidian hourglass. The sand didn't fall. It began to dissolve, turning into a dark, smoke-like vapor inside. The glass, Dot. This is the price of your arrogance, Alistair. You tried to build a monument to your own name on the blood of my history. So I am deleting the name. The silence in the office was deafening. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. A rhythmic, relentless reminder that his time was gone. Alistair looked at the pen for a long time. The rain outside seemed to scream against the glass, begging him to end it. He reached out. His fingers closed around the silver pen. He didn't look at the paper as he signed. He looked at me. He looked into the obsidian depth of my eyes and saw the end of his world. The signature was a jagged, desperate scrawl. The moment the pen left the paper, the lights in the office flickered. A power surge traveled through the building, resetting the systems. Deleting the Finch logo from every screen in the tower, it was done. I stood up. I adjusted the pendant around my neck. The sand was still once more, but it was no longer gray. It was black as the night outside. Get out, I said. My voice was a cold wind. He didn't move at first. He just stared at his hands, as if he expected them to disappear. The building belongs to the Vane-Redmond Trust now, I said, and I do not allow trespassers on my property, Alistair, or whatever he was now. Stood up. He didn't say a word. He walked toward the elevator. His shoulders were slumped. His spirit was a vacuum. He left the room, and he left the world. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. I looked out at the city. The rain was washing the name Finch off the billboards. The lights were changing. The history was being rewritten. I am Hestia Vane-Redmond, and I am the architect of the silence. The ground is not just dirt. It is a ledger, and I have just balanced the books. I am writing part 1 of the script. The silence in the penthouse was no longer sterile. It was heavy. It was a physical weight that pressed against the chest. The kind of silence that exists in the heart of a mountain. It's cold, unmoving, final. I sat in the executive chair. My fingers brushed the surface of the mahogany desk. It felt like a gravestone, smooth, polished, and marking the end of something that had no business living. I reached up and adjusted the obsidian hourglass pendant. The matte black of my skin felt cool against the glass. I looked at the man who used to be Alistair Finch. He was standing by the glass wall. His forehead was pressed against the cold pane. The rain was drumming a frantic rhythm on the other side, a sound of 1,000 tiny fingers trying to break in. He looked small. His neon suit, once a symbol of his loud, arrogant power, now looked like a costume from a play that had been canceled. "Medact Hestia," he said. He didn't turn around. His voice was a thin thread of sound, barely audible over the storm. How long I took a slow, measured breath. The air in the office was shifting. The scent of Alistair's expensive tobacco was being replaced by the smell of ozone and old, damp earth. The smell of the tea house. The smell of history reclaiming its space. How long did I plan this? I asked. My voice was a melodic whisper, a sound that traveled through the room like a shadow. I didn't plan this for you, Alistair. You are far too insignificant to occupy 40 years of my life. He turned then. His eyes were bloodshot. The pupils were pinpricks of terror. What are you talking about? 40 years. You didn't even know I existed until last year. I leaned forward. The golden desk lamp cast a sharp, architectural shadow of my bob across my face. I looked at him, not with anger, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a forensic accountant. I didn't need to know you, I said. I knew your type. I knew the new money predators who would eventually come for this city. I knew the men who thought that $1 billion loan made them masters of the universe. I knew that one day, someone would try to build a glass monument on the ground I protect. I touched the obsidian hourglass. I felt the vibration of the city's power grid beneath my feet in 1984. While I was working as a lead liquidator for the IMF, I was tasked with restructuring the debt of this very city. The politicians were desperate. They were bankrupt. They were willing to sign anything to keep the lights on. I drafted the subsurface security ordinance. I wrapped it in 1,000 pages of boring, technical jargon. I buried it under layers of sovereign immunity protocols. To the lawyers, it looked like a standard mineral protection clause. To the banks, it looked like a routine indemnity. But I wasn't protecting minerals, Alistair. I was digging a legal sinkhole. I created a sovereign corridor that runs through the bedrock of this entire district, a space that is legally recognized as a neutral territory, exempt from city zoning, exempt from federal eminent domain. I gave my family trust the absolute right of reversionary interest. Alistair stumbled back. His hands found the edge of a marble side table. He clung to it as if he were falling off a cliff. "You created the loophole," he whispered. "You wrote the law that is destroying me." "I didn't write a loophole, Alistair," I said. "I wrote a trap. I knew that eventually. A man like you would ignore the historical archives. I knew you would trust your modern surveys. I knew you would pour your foundations into the one place on this planet you could never own. Your tower isn't falling because of a structural error. It is falling because its legal foundation is a vacuum. You built a $4 billion empire on top of a sinkhole I dug 4 decades ago." I watched the realization hit him. It was a physical blow. His shoulders slumped. His jaw went slack. The arrogance that had sustained him. The loud, brash confidence of a man who thought he could buy the future. It broke. It didn't shatter. It dissolved. "Like salt in the rain, you're a monster," he said. The word had no bite. It was a statement of fact. "I am a liquidator," I replied. My voice was as steady as the horizon. "I see a debt, and I collect it. You thought you could evict a quiet woman from a tea house. You thought I was a relic of the past. But you forgot that the past is the foundation of the present." I stood up. My charcoal silk gown flowed over the floor like an oil slick. I walked toward the window. I looked out at the city. The lights were flickering, a sign that the trust was now taking control of the municipal grid. By morning, every building in this district will be audited. Every tenant will be notified. Their leases will not be renewed by Finch Global. They will be renewed by the Vane-Redmond Trust. Your name is already being scrubbed from the digital archives. The search engines are being updated. The news cycles are being fed the story of your catastrophic fiduciary negligence. In 24 hours, no one will remember that Alistair Finch ever owned a single brick in this city. I reached up and gripped the obsidian hourglass pendant. The sand inside began to flow upward, a dark, impossible movement that defied the gravity of his world. The deletion is not just financial, Alistair, it is historical. I turned to look at him one last time. He was sitting on the floor now, leaning against the marble. He looked like a child lost in a museum. "You called my tea house a stain on progress," I said. "Now your tower is a monument to my patience." I walked to the door of the office, the same door he had walked through a year ago to offer me $1 million to disappear. "The ground is mine, Alistair," I said. "It always was." I walked out of the penthouse. The silence followed me. The collapse was complete. The sun rose over the city not as a conqueror, but as a witness. The storm had passed, leaving the air scrubbed clean and smelling of wet earth and ozone. The frantic neon-soaked energy of the previous week had evaporated. In its place was a heavy, golden stillness. I sat in my usual spot, the oak chair in the corner of the tea house. The ivy outside the window was glistening with dew, a vibrant, unapologetic green. I reached up and adjusted the obsidian hourglass pendant. The black glass was warm from the sunlight, but the sand inside remained perfectly still. The time for deletion was over. The time for preservation had begun. 5 blocks away, the skyline had changed forever. The $4 billion skeleton of the Finch Horizon Tower was gone. It had not been blown up. It had been dismantled, piece by piece, bolt by bolt. A surgical removal of an infection. The site was no longer a wound in the earth. It was a meadow. I had exercised the right of specific performance under the 1892 King's Grant because the bedrock had been violated. The law required the land to be returned to its original sovereign state. I didn't just stop Alistair. I erased his footprint. I watched the steam rise from my teacup. A rare white peony blend. Delicate, rare, expensive. I thought about the nature of power. Men like Alistair Finch believe power is built of glass and steel. They believe it is measured in the height of a shadow. They are wrong. True power is the ability to turn a $4 billion investment into a field of clover. I heard the sound of a taxi pulling up outside. The engine was rattling. A sign of a vehicle at the end of its life. A door opened and closed. Alistair Finch approached the tea house. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked with the heavy, staggering gait of a man who had lost his gravity. He wasn't wearing the neon checkered suit. He was wearing a gray, mass-produced jacket he must have bought at a train station. His face was a map of exhaustion. His eyes were hollowed out by the realization that his name no longer existed. He stopped at the ivy-covered door. He didn't pound on it this time. He touched the wood as if it were a tombstone. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I waited for him to find his way to the window when he saw me. He didn't flinch. He just stared. He looked at my silver-white bob. He looked at the sharp, architectural line of my jaw. He looked at the obsidian hourglass pendant. I picked up a white envelope from the table. It was heavy, vellum sealed with black wax. I stood up and walked to the door. I opened it just enough to slide the envelope through. Alistair took it with trembling fingers. He broke the seal. It was not a lawsuit. It was an invoice. "What is this?" he whispered. His voice was a ghost of the roar it once was. "It is the bill for the grass," I said. My voice was a low, melodic hum that vibrated in the morning air. He looked at the bottom line. His eyes widened. $600,000. For grass. "It isn't just grass, Alistair," I said. "It is Kentucky bluegrass heritage seed. It is the cost of soil. Bioremediation. It is the fee for restoring the sovereign." Silence you broke with your drills. "Under the environmental indemnity clause of the foreclosure, you are personally liable for the restoration of the site. I have converted the lot into the Vane-Redmond Historical Preservation Park. A gift to the city." I leaned against the doorframe, the sunlight catching the matte finish of my skin. "Because it is a preservation park. It is now a tax-exempt sovereign sanctuary, which means the city can never build there again. Your tower, your legacy, your glass empire. It has been replaced by something you can never buy. Peace." Alistair looked toward the site. He could see the tips of the newly planted trees swaying in the breeze. He could see the wrought iron fence bearing the Vane-Redmond crest. "You destroyed me for a park," he said. The words were flat, empty. "I didn't destroy you. I corrected you." I said, "You were in error on a ledger that had been balanced for a century." I simply applied the liquidator's pen. I reached up and touched the pendant. "You called this shop a stain on progress," I continued. "But look at you now. You have no office. You have no stock. You have no name. You are a man standing in the rain of a storm that is already past. I am Hestia Vane-Redmond, and I am still seated." I closed the door. The brass deadbolt clicked into place. A final, metallic period at the end of a long sentence. I walked back to my chair. I sat down. I picked up my teacup. Through the window, I watched Alistair Finch turn away. He walked down the street, disappearing into the crowd of morning commuters. To them, he was just another man in a gray jacket. To the city, he was a myth that had been debunked. I looked at the obsidian hourglass. For the first time in 40 years, I turned it over. The sand began to fall, not as a countdown to destruction, but as a measurement of the peace I had restored. The ground is not just dirt. It is a memory, and I am its guardian. The city will grow. The lights will flicker. Other men will come with other dreams of glass. But they will look at the park on the corner of the district. They will see the silver-haired woman in the tea house, and they will remember. The queen remains seated, because she knows what is buried beneath the throne. I took a sip of the white peony tea. It was perfect. The debt was settled. The silence was restored. I am Hestia Vane-Redmond, and this is my city. The script is complete.